Okay, so sharing again. So we are just discussing the theory behind question 7. And if I went with something like biceps, where they're all parallel, right? And you have a tendon and a tendon. If I do the cross-sectional area here at the widest part, so it would be the cross-sectional area between that, let's say that's roughly the widest part. And that would be both the anatomical cross-sectional area, which is perpendicular to the line of action of the tendons. So there, so it would be 90 degrees to that. It would also be the physiological cross-sectional area, because if you looked at any individual fiber, it would be perpendicular to the actual individual fiber. And it's that perpendicular to the individual fiber when you're taking your cross-sectional area, which is called the physiological cross-section area, which is what governs how much force a muscle can create. The bigger that cross-sectional area, the more force you get out of the muscle. When we go to a pennated muscle, where you've got your two tendons, see, the advantage of the pennated muscle is that you can actually get in a greater actual cross-sectional area in the same sort of space, because the actual cross-sectional area is so if I went anatomical, it would be again perpendicular to these tendons, and it would be in this direction. So it'd be kind of here to here. That is not the cross-sectional area that I'm talking about that's related to force production. The cross-sectional area that's related to force production, just get rid of this guy, is perpendicular to these to each fiber. So, oops, that's a new one. Something basic, sorry, so basically like that, so that it would be 90 degrees to each of the fibers. And that would be my physiological cross-sectional area. And that's what we're looking for, is that physiological cross-sectional area. In general, roughly, and there are things that affect this, but just at a basic level, that cross-sectional area, the relationship between the force production of a muscle and the physiological cross-sectional area, sorry, maximum force production of the muscle and the physiological cross-sectional area is fixed. In here, they're talking about 90 newtons per centimeter squared. We're not, that's ballpark. There are things vaguely, certainly there's some illnesses and things that will affect that. There are some things that affect it, but it's actually relatively robust in that even with sex differences, it's there's no question that there's sex differences in strength. I mean, that's a given. That there's a wide range, and they overlap, which is why you can't just go with, that's why women can be firefighters and things, because it's not, there are certainly women who are perfectly capable of doing the strength required for that, and there's men who aren't. There is an overlap, but in general, if you were just looking at your mean strengths, women have about 2/3 the strength of men, roughly. But Why is that? Is that because their fibers don't create as much force? No, it's because they don't have the same cross-sectional area in general. So it really comes down to that cross-sectional area. We know that your fast twitch fibers are your strength fibers. They're the ones that create more force than the slow twitch fibers. Is that because because they have they certainly have different speeds of producing the force, no question on that. But in general, at max, is it because they have different amount of force production? No, it's because they have different cross-sectional areas. I mean, that's the size principle, right? The fast twitch fibers are the bigger fibers, so they make more force because they're the bigger fibers. So that's where this comes from. Again, there are some variations on that. It's just rough when we do this. And so you're looking for if you know how much force a muscle has to produce, then you can figure out what the cross-sectional area of the muscle has to be. And that's all they're asking. So once you've done 5 and 6 to figure out how much force has to be produced, you literally just have to divide it by 90. So force in newtons divided by 90 newtons per centimeter squared is going to leave you an area in centimeter squared. That answer the question?
Yeah, I just had trouble picturing it. You explained it very clearly. Thank you.
Oh, good. There's another piece to that, which I will also add in there because I have this teaching opportunity. It says minimum. Why do you think it's minimum? Anybody?
Because the angle can change.
The angle can change, but that's not totally in this question. This question's asking you what the minimum cross-sectional area is in a particular situation. So without changing the situation, why would that be the minimum? Any thoughts? Other thoughts? Because I mean, the angle will definitely change what the strength is, no question. Well, basically, it's asking minimum because if I have to produce, in order to do some activities, so some activity that happens to require 200 newtons in my muscle, it just, because of what I'm holding in my hand, I need 200 newtons in my biceps in order to, in the particular posture I am, and we'll get more in that in our next lectures. I know that I need to have 200 newtons in my muscle. That means I need to have 200 newtons in my muscle to do what I'm doing right now. It doesn't mean that I have to have turned on all of my muscle. At 200 newtons in my muscle, it could be that my muscle could easily create 400 or 500 newtons of force. I just need 200 right now, or newtons of force to do whatever I'm doing. So it's what's needed for this activity. It is not the maximum that the muscle can produce, because of course we know that one of the big things about muscle is that it has a graded response. It has the two things, recruitment and firing rate, right? So you can, if I need more force, I can recruit more motor units. I can increase the firing rates of the motor units that are on. So there are two ways to grade and increase the force in the muscle. It's just in questions 5 and 6, you're given an example of how much of something where you need a certain amount of force in your muscle. It doesn't say that that's the maximum force that's in the muscle. The muscle has to be able to do at least that much, or else you can't do the activity. If I'm, can only generate 200 newtons of force and I need 400 newtons of force, then I can't do the activity. That's why it's a minimum. but it doesn't mean that there can't be other motor units still, if I can do 400, and I could still have some motor units that need to be recruited. So that's why it's a minimum, if that is clear. Any other questions on that?
Can we please add question number 8 and 2 to the questions?
8 and 2 on additional problems.
Yeah, chapter 6.
Okay, and I also see that there's 6. Okay, so 8, 2, and 6. Okay, well, I did do 2 earlier for chapter 6. So let's go with 6 first. How much force must be produced by the fibers of a pennate muscle aligned at a 60-degree angle to a central tendon to create a tensile force of 200 newtons in the tendon? Okay. So again, we have 2 tendons, 1 tendon, 2 tendon. And as I said earlier, when I was talking cross-sectional area, the advantage of the pennated muscle is that you can pack in more fibers with a physiological cross-sectional area. So theoretically, you can create, well, not just theoretically, so you can create actual more force in the muscle, but there is a penalty, and the penalty is that not all of that force lies in the action. So each tendon over here is attached to a bone, of course, and it's the force between the 2 tendons that is the actual muscle force. But whereas the fibers are the things generating the force. So some of that force is going to go along the fiber, and some of it isn't. Some of it's just going to pull the 2 tendons together. But some is actually going to be in the order. So you have a fiber going this way. You've got a tendon going this way. There's 60 degrees, the angle of pennation, which I think, yes. And you have something that's going to end up pulling on the tendon of 200 newtons. So the tendon force is going to be 200. So we need to split this force, this fiber force, which is, so that's the force of the fiber. And it's going to have a component that way, which we're not worried about, and a component this way. And we need that component to be 200 newtons, which will eventually come along here so that this muscle can pull on the bone with 200 newtons. So we need to know what the fiber force is that is going to create 200 newtons. And this is really all of the fibers together. I'm just illustrating it with one, but really all of these fibers together are going to create, sorry, in this direction, a fiber force that we need it to be 200 newtons down here. And so we have a 60-degree angle, and we have, and this is adjacent, right? So the force of the fiber is going to, well, actually, let's go back a bit. And I mean, we are just breaking down into components. But 200 newtons divided by the force of the fiber, which is is going to equal cos 60. Force of the fiber is going to equal 200 newtons divided by cos 60. If somebody can plug that through, hopefully that is 400.
Yeah, that's 400.
That's going to equal 400 newtons. Fair enough. Any questions on that one? So you can see that even though by being pennated, you are actually going to be able to generate more force in your fibers because you can have a larger cross-sectional area of your fibers. There is a penalty that you will lose some of that some of that because it's not in line with the tendons, and what you're interested in is the force from the tendons. Now there is some really neat research that they've done where they look at this angle as you walk. The angle of pennation doesn't actually stay fixed. It changes as you go through your walking motion. For your, I think soleus, they did. And what ends up happening is that by the angle of pennation changing as you go through, yes, you have a greater or lesser penalty of how much force is actually going to go down along the tendon, which is what you want to generate force. But it also helps to keep the muscles at the same by changing that angle of pennation at a point where the muscle is getting shorter, which means the two tendons are getting shorter. If you do accomplish that by changing the angle of pennation, you actually keep the can maintain some of the length of the muscle, so you don't get that force length penalty. Now, that is not something I'm going to test you on. That's just something that's some really interesting research I've seen where they actually put an ultrasound on top of the muscle as you're going through the cyclical motion, so they can actually measure changes not only in the length of the muscle tendon complex, but also changes in that angle of pennation, and that ends up affecting fiber length, which is ultimately the part that gets affected by the force length curve, the active component of the force length curve. Okay, so no other questions on that one? Number 8, if the biceps brachii attaching to the radius 2.5 centimeters from the elbow joint produces 250 newtons of tension perpendicular to the bone, and the triceps brachii attaching 3 centimeters away from the elbow joint exerts 200 newtons of tension perpendicular to the bone, how much net torque is present at the joint, and will there be flexion, extension, or no movement at the joint? So this is one of those rare situations where if you sketched it, so I have my, well, we'll just do a forearm. There's a hand over here. where the elbow is not going to be right here at the end. The elbow is going to be realistically there. So that's my actual axis of my rotation, the center of my elbow joint, because reality is that on one side, I have the force of my biceps, and on the other side, sorry, and this is not to scale in any way, shape, or form, I have the force of my triceps. And the biceps is producing 250 newtons, and it's perpendicular here. And the triceps is creating 200 newtons. Okay, not drawn to scale at all. Sorry, folks. And this distance, the distance from the center of the joint, which is my axis of rotation, to my triceps is 3 centimeters. And the on the other side, I have 2.5 centimeters. I think I've read all of those correctly. So, what is the torque produced by the biceps? No, let's not do it that way. Times 0.025 meters, which equals
6.25.
6.25 Newton meters of torque. The torque, again, that is the strength of the biceps at this point, which is the torque produced by the biceps in this situation. The torque produced by triceps is going to equal 200 newtons times 0.03 meters, or 6 Newton meters. Okay, so even though this guy produces more force, well, this guy does produce more force and he produces more torque. We all agree with that? And so this guy wins. In the winning, if you have both your biceps and your triceps on, the direction you're going to move, assuming you don't have other torques that you're worried about. So let's say I'm in this plane, and I turn both those muscles on. If I turn both of them on and I don't move, that means that the torque produced by the biceps and the torque produced by the triceps are the same. Whichever, but if they're not the same, I'm going to, in a situation where I have no other forces, so like this, and I turn both of them on and I actually move in a direction, that means that the muscle that is in that direction is the one that has the higher torque. So I am going to, the actual net torque at my joint is going to be the sum of my torques. And let's just say that I call a torque that goes this way as positive. So that's going to be, this guy's going to try and bring my forearm up that way, which is good. So that we'll call that positive. 6.25 Newton meters minus, and this guy's going to try and rotate my arm the other way, which makes sense. 6 Newton meters. Going to be left with 0.25 Newton meters. And the winner here, because this is positive, is, and I considered the biceps torque as positive, this is a flexion, flexor torque. Any questions on that? This is basically very similar to a seesaw or a teeter-totter where the flexor muscles are on one side trying to rotate the teeter-totter, and the triceps muscles are on the other side trying to rotate it the other way. And it's a combination of not just how much force it is, but how far away from that axis of rotation it is. You have to account for both.
I have a really stupid question.
There is none.
Oh, trust me, this one is, I don't understand what a moment arm is.
That's actually a very good question, and a lot of people that is. So let me just clear this because. So let's say I have a board. And in the middle of the board is a hinge that it's rotating around. So it's like it's like a rotating door that you're looking down on from the top. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If I push on it over here, it's going to rotate around this way. And if I pushed on it here, it would rotate around this way. So I have this thing and it's on this hinge. Sorry, hinge. And I decide to push on this board here. And it's going to create a torque. Remember, anything that creates rotating motion, rotary motion, is a torque. And a torque is a force times the moment arm. Well, the force is going to be obviously this, whatever the magnitude of this is. But then we have to multiply it, of course, so the torque equals the force times the moment arm. And I'm pushing out here, so I'm pushing this distance here. That is not the moment arm. The moment arm is, if I draw, I have to go somewhere along the line of action of this force and draw a line that if I drew it 90 degrees to this force, like here, it actually passes through this axis of rotation. So this would not be a moment arm. But if I drew a line right here, it's 90 degrees to the line of action of my force, and it passes right through my my axis of rotation. This right there is moment arm.
Thank you.
Now, it's that one's, you know, somewhat easier. I really have three situations. I'm coming at it from this angle, like I just showed, or I'm coming straight, oh, sorry, straight at it. If I'm going straight at it where the force is actually pushing 90 degrees onto that board, then D equals the moment arm. So they're the same thing this time, because here the force is, so if I drew a line that was 90 degrees to this force and went across, it would be that distance. So that's situation number 2. And then the final one, which isn't always as easy to picture, is if I was to, and I'm actually going to have to erase this guy too in this particular case, where the force came in over here. Now, if I drew any lines perpendicular to this, obviously it's not going to pass through this guy over here. It would just keep going and going. It's not going to pass through there. So I have to actually, again, it's the line of action of the force. So the force can be considered, the line of action of the force is anything on this line. So I actually have to come ahead of where that contacts to here in order to draw a line that's 90 degrees to the line of action, and goes through my axis of rotation. Hope that helps. There are some examples of that in, I don't know, chapter 13. I know we talked about it in chapter 3. And they allude to it in chapter 6 because it's kind of important, because muscles come in at an angle like this to the bone. And there's actually some practice problems. I think it's chapter 13.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I kind of find this chapter like harder than the other ones, chapter 6. Are we like getting more calculation problems or like explanation, like, I don't know, fill in the blanks kind of questions for the exam? Like, do we have to read the textbook, like the texts, or do we need to like practice more questions?
I'm not quite sure where you're coming from. Some of this will become more clear when we actually, this is the chapter that brings together physiology and biomechanics. I mean, the reality is that biomechanics, worries about, given, these mechanical variables like the physical length of the muscle, the physical length of the fibers, the velocity of shortening or lengthening, because as if you quickly move a joint versus you slowly move a joint, that means the fibers are going to be contracting at a different velocity. It's a very mechanical, when you think about it, it's a very mechanical value. It's not a physiological value. It's created by physiology because it's created because these fibers are, the actin and myosin are sliding across each other. You've got the cross bridges forming, the cross bridges are releasing and going farther out and pulling in. But the effect is mechanical. It's you're producing force. You are producing force that is dependent on other mechanical variables like velocity and length, which is completely related to joint angle and joint velocity. Absolutely, totally linked to that. So this is the chapter that brings those together, and they're a little vague at this point in time. They give you the mechanical, okay, these are the things you have to think of. So that pennated angle one that I talked about, here's the penalty for having the pennated angle, or angle of pennation. There is a positive, as I said, you ultimately will get more force out of it because it can have a bigger cross-sectional area. but you will lose some of that force. So it's conceptual in terms of how a muscle actually creates strength, because ultimately, when it comes right down to it, strength is a torque. And we don't actually get into the whole piece of how muscle creates torque in a much more biomechanics sense than physiological sense, is chapter 13, I think. I'm pretty certain it's chapter 13. So the yeah, so I don't know what the things in this question, in this chapter, are for you just to realize how a force length, how important force length is. And force length is really important because it talks about that in every posture you're in, you have different strength capabilities. So, you know, if you're exercising in different postures, you're going to be using different percentages of your strength, and you may or may not be able to do it because of that. So that's where this chapter gets to. So I'm not quite sure what you want. And it also talks about the rotary component. This chapter is big on the rotary and stabilizing component of the fat muscle, and the idea that a muscle, part of a muscle is related to try and rotate a bone around a joint, and part of it is to either pull the two bones together that create the joint, something called a stabilizing component, or to actually pull it apart, which isn't really that great. So dislocating component, and identifying that rotary component is what creates the torque. So I'm not sure what else you want to know about the kinds of questions they could be. They could be the theory of force length and force velocity and anatomical cross-sectional area, or they could be pennated muscles, or they could be considerations of where those come into play when you're doing an activity.
Yeah, can you please go over the graph of force velocity again? Okay.
Sure. Absolutely. And then we'll do strength training. Okay, we don't do a lot on the training thing here, I'll have to say. Okay. If you have a muscle, and let's do the classic biceps. So you have two bones. Let me rearrange that because that is probably not the best way to do it. So if I have my biceps here, and in all places it's, you know, kind of starting just above the biceps notch there and coming down and grabbing there and there and so hopefully you can see that even though the muscle joins the same, starts and ends at the, or originates and inserts at the same place, as a function of joint angle, it keeps getting longer, right? L1, L2, L3, and you can see L3 is bigger than L2, is bigger than L1. And so that's the actual length of the muscle, which is related to the length of the fibers, particularly in something like biceps, which is where all the fibers are in parallel. So it turns out, so this is force and this is length. If I turned on all those fibers 100%, and this is important because in a force length curve, we are comparing everything on this curve has to be at the same activation. It doesn't have to be at 100, but we normally describe it as 100 because that's the max that you could be doing. So this is if I turned on all the fibers, and of course, 100% means I have recruited all of my motor units, and I have all of my motor units at maximum firing rates, because those are my two ways of grading muscle. And so I've turned them all on. And even though I've turned them all on, there's, depending on whether I have a short muscle, a medium muscle, or a long muscle, the amount of force that I can produce in the fiber is different. And this part right here is called the resting length. So the resting length, and then anything shorter than the resting length is the force goes down, and anything bigger than the resting length, the force production goes down. For just this active component, we're only talking the active component. There's two components to the force length thing, but for the active component. And resting length, I've heard somebody say anatomical position. It is not anatomical position. It tends to be that resting length for most muscles occur where that muscle's being used the most. It's not even the most common, but it's where we tend to use it. So in the elbow, for example, biceps tends to be around 90 degrees. It's not exactly 90 degrees, but it's around 90 degrees. That's in here somewhere. So why is it that we can't create as much force when it's shorter or longer actively? So longer's easier. I always look at it from the perspective of, let's say I was in a tug of war, and the amount of force that you produce in a muscle is related to the number of cross bridges that are attached. It's very simple. More cross bridges you have, more force you have. So if the cross bridges, it attaches and it tries to pull. It's not always successful in pulling, but it tries to pull in the one direction. And so it's always pulling, and then the more cross bridges that you have formed, the more pull you're going to have formed. And you have more cross bridges because you have more fibers active. That would be recruitment. Or because there just is a better alignment in the actin and myosin, that the cross bridges actually align in such a way that cross bridges can form. If the muscle, if you think of your actin and myosin as in a situation that would be like a tug of war, as I said, and you've got the protein along the bottom, and then you've got which is the rope. You've got the rope, and you've got the two teams, and both teams have 8 people on it. So that means 16 hands on that rope. 16 hands pulling on that rope. And if the teams get moved farther apart, but the rope stays the same length, as you move farther apart, that means that the 2 back people on the rope can no longer hold on to the rope. And now instead of 16 hands on the rope, you're down to 12 hands on the rope, because there are only 6 people now on, let's say, on your team who can still hold on to it, which means 12 hands on the rope. So you've dropped down. Obviously, the force or the tension in that rope, if it went down from 16 hands on each side to 12 hands on each side, I think you can imagine that the tension that's in that rope has now dropped. And that's only because it got farther and longer away, right? So you all had to take a step away, and that meant those back 2 people on both teams could no longer reach the rope. So the actual tension that's in the rope, even though all of them are still trying, those back 2 aren't doing anything because they're not really actually attached to the rope anymore. And so that's what happens over here. On that long side, as it goes in, you can't actually create, the back 2 aren't actually creating cross bridges anymore. There's not as many binding sites available to create cross bridges. And the same thing happens on the other side, only it's if everybody came in towards the center. And let's say the center of the rope is, I don't know, greased, very slippery compared to the rest of the rope. That means those people in the front really aren't creating any force either, because they can't really create a positive bond with the rope and pull. So if you get shorter, that means that, again, your actin and myosin are coming in together, and the cross bridges at the front really aren't doing anything because there's not a binding site for them to grab hold of. So the longer it gets, the less force you're going to get, and the shorter it is, the less force you're going to get. That's the active component. And it is dependent on recruitment. That's why it has this 100% piece. You have to, it's based on what the actual amount of recruitment that is happening. So, I mean, the reality is, if your brain turns the muscle off, there is no force there that's active anymore. Passive, however, the passive force is there whether you've turned the muscle on or not, and it is only due to the length of the muscle. And the reality is that muscles have all sorts of elastic tissues around the outside of it, and within around each fiber, there are a lot of elastic type tissues, and that as the muscle gets longer, there actually will be force in the muscle that you can feel that is created, and that's created regardless of whether, again, you're recruiting it at 80% or 0% or 100%, that force is there. But that's why it's called passive, because there's nothing the brain can do to do it. And you feel that one all the time when you do stretches, when you're exercising. If you stretch out, you don't turn on your muscle while you're stretching out, but you feel the force in that muscle. And what do you do when you're trying to stretch out a muscle or a joint? Is you actually extend the joint as far as possible. I know we're mostly doing leg stretches and things, but I was doing wrist stretches. I'm passively stretching my wrist, and I can feel it. I can feel there's a lot of tendons in your wrist, and so I'm stretching them when I bring them back. So that's, anytime we are stretching a joint, we are doing this. We are bringing the joint to the point where the muscle that crosses that joint that's of interest to us gets longer. Clearly, at the same time, something gets shorter. If I do, your classic triceps surae stretch, where you have your foot down and you lean forward like that, and you're going to stretch these muscles, right? Triceps surae, but at the same time, your tib anterior here is going to get short, so you're not stretching it at all. But that's stretching, and what you're feeling there is the passive component of the muscle. At any point in time or any posture that you're in, the muscle force that is available to you is a combination of both of them. So when it's shorter than my resting length, that's how much force my muscle can generate, and no more. That's 100% activation. And if it's really short, that means nothing. I can barely, and if you want to figure that one out, this is the classic. Try and grab here. You can almost grab nothing. There's almost no force available to your muscle if for grabbing when it's all short like that. And then after the resting length, sort of this maximum, it just is coincidental that passive forces for the most part start to generate after your maximum force production of your fibers. What you get out of the muscle is actually going to be a straight adding of the two. So if I add that to this guy, it's going to be there. If I add this much there, if I add that much there, and so my actual final curve is going to look something. I'm sorry, that's a really bad drawing. It's going to look something like and then once this guy isn't creating anything, it's all going to be passive. So at a certain point, it doesn't even matter if you're stretching out a muscle, even if you tried to turn it on, it wouldn't generate a whole heck of a lot of force. Almost all the force that's in that muscle is from stretching. And so your green is your final force length curve, and it's made by adding the active component and the passive component. And the active component is you take at
اینجا به نظر
خب
من
میاد
بهتره.
پایین‌تر دوباره نمیره بالا. میخوای دی ترید
Pardon? I'm sorry, it didn't come through. I think I had several people asking at the same time. Okay. Any other questions on that? Okay. Introductory problem on number 6. How is the force velocity curve affected by strength training? If we're talking strength only, you are going to be increasing the force that is created at each velocity, because for each velocity, you're going to have a greater cross-sectional area. And if you think that one through, that actually should mean that you will end up with a little bit farther out for the velocity that you can take. but it's probably going to be more of a percentage, which means it would be comes down to the same location, but it's going to be higher, definitely higher static, no question, higher static. And then will be higher for each of the different velocities, but not as much. So it's not a fixed amount, but a graded amount of how it's going to affect the different velocities. If you only do it as strength and no changes in the actual velocities themselves. Any other questions? Amos.
Yeah, it'll be chapter 12. I think it's additional problem number 6. Or yeah, I think it's 6.
The golf club?
Yeah, where we have to use the angular and then convert to linear, and then we get momentum, and then we have to find the final calculation.
Okay, now, first of all, the linear momentum piece, and I think I say this in the questions, is we don't actually get to linear momentum till later. So we come back to this chapter later on in the course when we're doing momentum, and we do both linear and angular together. So the linear momentum per se is mass times velocity. So really the only part on here that you want to find out is the velocity at impact, right?
I believe that's true. I just want to make sure I'm doing the steps correctly, because I get the right answer, but I can't really prove it conceptually, if that makes sense.
So the important thing with a golf swing is that you want the velocity of the head of the golf club to be as high as possible when it hits the ball. I mean, there's some directional components too, because a fast velocity that goes straight down into the ball doesn't do much. It's got to lift it up. That gets into elements of projectile motion, but you want a fast velocity, because the greater the momentum of the golf club, the more the momentum will be changed to the golf ball. So, and again, the actual linear momentum I don't cover till almost the second last week of classes. But so it's mass times velocity. So I think the mass times velocity piece is easy, right? So the mass is, if I took 3.9 and divided it by 0.73, which is the mass of the golf club, that would be the velocity at impact. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think you just use the acceleration and time to solve for that velocity.
Yep, that's it. That's exactly it. So you figure out something that is swung for 0.5 seconds with a constant acceleration of 10 radians per second squared. You can figure out what the actual angular velocity is at impact. It starts at 0. It increases for half a second at 10 radians per second squared. So that'll give you the angular velocity at impact. And then using the 108 centimeters, you can convert that to a linear velocity.
Is it correct that I did this where I said tangential acceleration is equal to angular acceleration times radius?
Yep.
Okay, okay, just making sure I got the right steps.
Yeah, you can do it either way. You can figure out, you're absolutely right. You can, because what you're wanting to figure out is the tangential velocity. So you can either switch to a tangential acceleration and using the radius, and then just go from 0 to whatever that new velocity is using that tangential acceleration. Absolutely, totally correct. Or you can figure out it goes from 0 radians per second to however many radians per second using that angular acceleration of 10 radians per second. And then once you have that new angular velocity at impact, you convert it to your tangential velocity. Either way works. You can do it one way or the other. It doesn't make a difference. You will get the same answer. Good.
Yeah, I think a lot of the questions are very relevant to what we already did. So the other ones were like projectile motion. And then we did in class the theory about Newton's law, and I'm kind of, I say it, kind of did it in high school already. So I kind of know that stuff.
There is nothing, there is very little, very little / nothing that I do that I can't find in the mandatory curriculum 9-10 science curriculums for science. The only difference is applying it to human movement. It's hard to explain to people. Really, what we're doing is stuff that you didn't have to take high school physics, and you didn't have to take or like high school advanced physics, or because most of it is stuff. I mean, you did Newton's law probably in grade 9 or 10 and 11 and 12. It's a pretty mandatory part of any high school science, even the mandatory piece. I mean, you have to take 9 and 10 science, I think.
Is it like chapter 13 when we start to relate the two, or
What?
because right now for chapter 12, it's a lot of like the isolated systems that we already done previous, like in high school, but then we haven't combined it to the actual like biomechanical part yet.
Well, depends what you think of as biomechanical. Certainly the friction one is very biomechanical, especially its relationship to the ground reaction force is hugely important, and that's linear. That you know, you work for Nike or Reebok or any of those guys with their shoes, it's hugely important. Or even if you worked, I was touring one place, and they studied the relationship between work boots and the ground, because you know, slips and trips in a workplace are a great reason for people having injuries. So you are basically combining the frictional component of the shoe workplace interface, and with how much force is being generated by the person as they walk along the floor. So yes, it isn't biomechanical in that it's not internal biomechanical, but it's still considered biomechanics because it's talking about, you know, which direction things are going. I mean, I watch this week, if you're at all into curling, the Scotties are on, and they've been showing the Scotties. And every time I watch curling, I look at, okay, if you hit it this way, which direction would it go, and things like that. So that would probably be the mechanics of curling. I know there's books out there, the mechanics of baseball and stuff like that. And part of it is literally projectile motion and all those things. Or a force hits it this way, where would you expect something to go? So is that sports biomechanics because it doesn't happen to have a muscle involved in it? Or does it only become biomechanics when it's internal to the body? I would say no, it's not just internal to the body, although internal to the body is important, and it depends what kind of biomechanics you're looking at. If you're doing sports biomechanics, a lot of it is exactly what you're seeing here in chapter 12. Chapter 13 is where we bring in that whole idea of muscle, which is what you're thinking, I think.
Yeah, it's because we're doing it isolated where we say for chapter 6, all the muscle, and then for chapter 12, it's all the mechanics. So I'm wondering when they combine.
Yeah, no, it's chapter 13 because, and the reason is because muscle is rotational. It rotates. Muscle causes rotation around the joints. So we're not going to be looking at it in linear kinetics. We're going to be looking at it when we look at rotational kinetics, because strength is torque. So we really have to go to this torque piece before we can totally get understand what muscles do and how muscles generate force, and how you decide, if you're working at a fitness club, which muscle group would be active in an activity. I mean, it is relatively logical as long as you understand the kinetics of the situation, but it's rotational. And that's why 13, you don't get to it till 13, because it's rotational. So it's torque. Any other questions, anybody? If that's the case, have a great